I'm very excited to present to you guys today. I'm presenting on two topics that have been really influential to me in my major, and they are ethnocentrism from intercultural communication and the standpoint theory, which is from gender communication. So we're going to start out with the definitions that I've gathered from ethnocentrism, about ethnocentrism. It's kind of a combination of definitions that I have, mainly from Bradford Hall's book, Among Cultures, but it says, assuming that one's group is the center of the world. So before I really get into explaining what this means, I'm going to do this little activity that this woman, she's a journalist, her name is Esther Honig or something like that, I don't know how to say her last name, but she sent this photo of herself, unedited, unretouched, to 25 different countries and their graphic designers, and said, make her beautiful. And that was like all she said, so she just wanted to have herself be beautiful in their different cultures. So what I'm going to have you do, I only have 10 of them, just for time's sake, but I'm going to show them and just have you guess where you think she's from. Okay, here's the first one. Any guesses?
Middle East, somewhere.
Okay. All right. So this one is from Morocco. This is the next one. Any guesses?
America.
Sounds like makeup.
Brazil.
Okay. Argentina. So South America. Guesses? Very extreme hair.
Russia.
Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, perfect. Thanks.
Oh, perfect.
Much better.
She's from the Philippines.
Mm.
Here's our next one. Her skin's lighter in this one.
South Korea.
Yeah, Asia.
Indonesia.
Mm.
Right. Makeup. Got the thing in her hair.
China.
It's in South America. It's a guess or a clue. It's Chile. Okay, here's this one. I can't remember what this one is. Greece. Okay. This one, she has blue eyeliner or eyeshadow. It's very distinctive. This one is from Kenya. There's a few more. This one is Serbia. I actually could guess this one. Got the eyebrows for me. It's India. And this is the last one. What are our guesses here? This is actually the United States' interpretation. So we're all American in here. So we all think this person, she looks the most beautiful, right? Oh.
Absolutely.
No? Okay, but like, since we're all American, we think that all these women look wrong and they should try to conform. Let's say that you actually thought she looked good, because apparently you don't.
Well, no, I think she doesn't look good.
No, I know. But just, so we have this interpretation that our culture, if she were to look very pretty, that's how everybody should conform, and she should look like her. So that's one of the base things that comes with being ethnocentric. And how I'm going to explain ethnocentrism to you is through worldviews. And there's 7 big worldviews, but the first one, I think the easiest one to understand, is how we perceive time in culture. So as Americans, what does time look like to you? Yeah.
It's important. You have a place to be. You should be there early.
Right.
At least that's what I've seen in my time. Earlier on time, and be true to your word. If you say you're going to be somewhere, you should be there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
You're only on time if you're 10 minutes early.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so like, if you had an interview at 1 p.m. and you showed up at 1:10, what would happen?
Would
you-
get the job.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't get the job in America. Well, when I took intercultural, I took it from C.D. Mayara. Hopefully you've all had a chance to take a class from him. He's a wonderful professor, wonderful guy, and he brought a new viewpoint to this for me. In Mauritania, he's from West Africa, they have a very different perception of time. He would tell us that when he first came to America, he thought Americans were so rude because he would be on campus and he'd run into somebody that he knew and they would pretend they didn't see him, or they would just smile at him, not stop to have a conversation with him, and that was so different than what it's like in Mauritania. Because there, if you see an old friend, you're gonna stop and talk to them until you figure out what's going on in their life, and that's what's respectful in their culture. So I give the example, if you were to show up 10 minutes too late to an interview because you ran into a friend, he could just say that within his culture and that would be completely normal. And it's much more disrespectful to blow off a friend and not have a conversation with them than to be late to a meeting. So our culture is called monochronic, and then his culture is called polychronic. And the reason that this is so important is because it starts leading people to think that the way they're performing is better than another person. So if CD came to America and he said, these Americans are so rude, why don't they act like everybody in Mauritania? Why don't they make sure that they always stop and have full conversations when they're headed to a class and they see a friend across the quad? They should stop and talk to them for 15 minutes and be late to their class, so they should conform and be like me. That's not going to work in America. That's not what our culture is. And the same thing being if I were to go to Mauritania and say, all these Mauritanians don't know how to conduct their lives. They should have scheduled, be on time to appointments. And being ethnocentric leads to really big conflicts. And the first one that popped in my head is this one. Why did this happen? Can somebody explain to me why the Holocaust or World War II happened?
Because Jews are lesser, or so the Nazis.
Right.
I was like,
Good. Yeah. So, yeah, Jews, and he specifically was a fan of the Aryan race and thought that they looked better, and the way that Jews or gypsies or homosexuals performed was incorrect. And so instead of just being intolerant and saying that they should conform to me, he decided, let's get rid of them. And so we have this one culture that is the best culture. And we're probably all not going to be like Hitler and think that we need to get rid of people who don't act like us. But we do have ways that we are ethnocentric in our daily lives that are still very harmful. And where I'm going to explain this is here. And it's a little awkward or controversial. Jared actually talked about abortion also. But this is my niece. I decided to bring her into the presentation because I love her very much. But there's a worldview on when life starts. And there's a couple of worldviews. What are those two worldviews that we might have?
Pro-choice.
Go, Jared, yes.
So birth and conception?
Yeah, so some people believe that life is going to start at birth. Other people might think life starts at conception. And those are two worldviews that are very different, and you might have very strong opinions about one of them, but thinking that your worldview is the only worldview is where we come into conflict. So how I'm going to explain this is I'm going to just have you guys pair up. I want one person to take the worldview of life begins at birth, and then the other person to take the worldview that life begins at conception, and explain to the other person and make them believe exactly what you believe. So if you just want to pair up, go for a minute or so, and then we'll come back and discuss. Yeah.
Wait, no, we're not saying birth. I want conception, not birth.
I was like, I think it's pretty hard.
So one of the first reasons why I like conception is because if you kill a pregnancy, you are trying for double homicide, which means that the law is already based in our country. Black people lights right up to phallus. Anyway, convincing myself.
Convince me.
I don't know anymore. Don't you think that why would you want to go and help this thing that has the potential to grow into a living human baby?
You ready?
Yeah, sure.
Have you start wrapping up? Have you convinced them?
No.
Oh, give me a few more minutes.
So,
Let's see.
as you can see, it is determined on whether it's communicated. And when it's inside the female's body before it's birth, it's still a part of that person. It's not its own thing, meaning it's not separate. And so by having it say that like life begins in conception, they're putting something else that isn't in the world yet over a priority.
Wouldn't you say that a baby couldn't survive on its own? A born baby?
I don't consider it a baby. I consider it like a combination of cells at that point.
No, I mean after birth.
No, it could. Because like breathing
That's
and
good,
functioning.
Carson. That's enough. All right, everybody.
All right, Libby.
So we can keep discussing what happened there. Did you convince the other person?
No.
You did, Jared. Tell me how you convinced
Ethos.
Yeah.
Okay.
Used a lot, or no, pathos. Just a ton of emotions.
Emotions.
Just overwhelmed her with emotions.
Was that where you were
Pictures of
the
my
life
niece.
starts at conception?
That's how we got the liberal. Yeah.
Okay, but like, so why didn't it work though? Because you have these two different worldviews. Why didn't convincing them that their worldview was wrong? Like, why didn't that work?
I think for me, I'm so like this like that life begins at conception that I was like I'm not like you can tell me what you want to tell me, but I'm not going to listen to you because I already believe what I believe.
Also, it was hard to argue since we just had to each pick one. I didn't necessarily agree with the one that I was saying, so it's kind of hard to try and convince her of something I don't typically believe in.
Right. And especially because something like this is something that you're probably taught when you were really young. With people who have religious upbringings, they are taught that life begins at conception generally, and so it's really impacted them, and it's part of who they are. They completely believe that, and so it's part of their culture. And trying to convince somebody that their culture is wrong is not going to work because it's something that is part of their personality and their identity. So that's what I have with ethnocentrism. Are there any questions about this so far before I start going into my next concept? Yes.
Are there any benefits?
To being, I think there's no problem with being proud of who you are and being proud of the culture that you come from and trying to make that as impactful as possible, like being as prosperous through the culture that you have. But when you're trying to get people to be exactly like you and telling them that they're wrong is when it becomes dangerous. So now that we've talked about that culture, we're going to talk about how culture might influence your positions and your standpoint in society and how you understand society. So standpoint theory is a feminist epistemology. And this again is the definition that I've come up with from Molly Murphy's gender class and through the book Gendered Lives that Fixmer and Orez wrote. And it says, the marginalized or minority part of the population have a better understanding of the society as a whole because they have to understand their own culture and the culture of the majority to succeed. So again, this is kind of a controversial theory. It comes from feminist movements and from different types of civil rights movements. And how Molly describes this in her class is kind of an analogy of a basketball stadium where you have a bunch of different seats, and so the first seat that you might have is like up close, really close to the action. If you're going to an NBA game, these seats are generally expensive, but you can see everything really well, and so it's probably kind of privileged. And then there's also these seats that are way back here where you can still see everything. You can still perfectly see everything that's happening up there. But also, you can see everything else that's happening in front of you. So you can see the back of these people's heads. You can see how hard it is for this person to see, or anything like that. So, as an analogy, the person standing far behind can see the entire stadium rather than the person who's sitting up front, who can only see a small portion of it, their own portion of it, rather than this person who can see everybody else's portion. Another analogy Molly gave me was what a road cyclist has to know on the road. So we have some rules of the road, like as a driver. What are some rules of the road that you have to follow when you're driving a car? Pedestrians have the right of way.
Use your blinker.
Use your blinker.
Stop at red.
Right. Okay. So those are rules that we know as drivers. Maybe what are some rules that you might need to know as a cyclist? Yeah.
Arm signals for turning.
Right.
Wear a helmet.
Yeah. And if you're go ahead, Austin.
Well, just like where the safe bike lanes are.
Yeah. So if you're in a car, do you really need to know those rules? You don't need to know that. You don't have to use your arm as a signal. You don't have to watch for an upcoming car on your left. As an example, my sister's a big cyclist. She was driving in Provo one time, and she was in her bike lane, but a car came up beside her, wasn't really paying attention. She has to be hyperactive because it's more dangerous, and the car came up beside her and almost knocked off her bike and just smacked the side of their car to make sure they weren't gonna hit her off her bike. So there's more things that you have to know when you're in this less privileged position. So Sandra Harding is a big theorist behind the standpoint theory. So I'm going to have her talk about some of the parts of it.
Having a very particular historical lineage, and it does. Marx asked the question, what can we learn about how the class system works by starting off from workers' lives, rather than starting off from the lives of the elites of the day. And 100-something years later, feminists picked this up and transformed it. It does have a source in 19th century and earlier European philosophy, but the feminist standpoint was specifically developed, as I indicated earlier, as a result of the research being done out of the politics of the women's movement, right, by sociologists, political scientists, and so forth. However, so that's the official intellectual lineage of standpoint theory, but the standpoint approaches appear to be organic in this sense. Every time a new group steps on the stage of history, it tends to say something like, gee whiz, from the perspective of our lives, things look different. So you can see the civil rights movement saying that, you can see the poor people's movements, you can see post-colonial and decolonial movements saying that, lesbian, gay, bi, trans. So standpoint methodology and theory is a kind of organic logic of research, I would say.
Okay. So what are some things that you gathered from that? What is like the biggest thing that you understood or took away from what she was saying there? Go for us.
That us as individuals have our own kind of perspective on the world, depending on our own situation.
Right. So she talks how this is actually, it's a feminist theory, but it is much older than that. It goes back to Marx. He says that maybe instead of looking at history from the leaders or the people in power, we should look at the history from the workers, because it's going to be a different kind of a history. And then there's another little snippet from it.
So what do I want readers to take away from this article, the most important point? I think it's that we should always ask whose knowledge is being produced, for whom is a particular piece of research going to provide benefits, and who's going to bear the costs of that being the question pursued rather than others that might be important.
So what the last thing that she's talking about there is a reflection of power. We gain standpoints as a result of a reflection of power based on the positions that we have. And our positions are what we identify as. So I am a woman, I'm white and I come from a pretty affluent family. What are some positions that you guys might have?
I'm an Asian American bisexual man.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So, when I say that you can gain a standpoint from your position, it doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to have a standpoint because of a position. So, you normally will have a better standpoint if you're a marginalized person, so a person of color, a person of a sexual orientation that's not heterosexual. Generally, women are marginalized more often than men. But as a woman, maybe I don't have a standpoint, a feminist, a woman's standpoint, because my entire life I've never been marginalized. I've always been allowed to be in positions of power, or I've always been successful, and I've never had to change who I was to maybe act like a man to become successful. So how you gain standpoints is through that reflecting on that power and that marginalization in society. And where we're going to look at that is from this great Twitter account that you should all follow. It's me. So I tweeted this a couple months ago, before I learned about standpoint theory actually, and it's how I gained a standpoint as a woman. So I said, I've been a feminist for as long as I can remember. My sister told me that J.K. Rowling's publisher told her to publish under a pseudonym because if people thought she was a man, she would sell more books. At 6, I understood that men got more respect than women. So I gained a standpoint as a woman, and it was important to me because I learned as a 6-year-old that I should start acting like a boy, and that's how I'd be successful. I'm not J.K. Rowling, so this isn't my personal account of being marginalized. And why I'm saying that is because if you are somebody who's naturally going to be marginalized, you can still gain standpoints, but it takes a little bit more reflection. So you could see this example of J.K. Rowling, who was marginalized who, as a woman and published as J.K. Rowling rather than Jennifer Rowling, and she sold more books. And you could say, oh, women have been marginalized, and so that gives them a understanding of what society is. And so they understand their role as a woman, and they also have to act as a man to be successful. And why, I don't think I've gone into this enough, but why the marginalized have a better understanding of society is because of what I just said. I'll use an example of a black person. A black person has to understand their culture as a black person, and then they have to understand the culture of white people to be successful and recognized in society. And a white person won't necessarily have to understand a black person's culture to be successful. So they understand everything rather than just the white person's culture. And I have an example of this. Lights again, please. From one of my favorite movies of all times, Remember the Titans.
Reserve the right to refuse service to anybody. Yeah, that means you too, hippie boy. Now y'all want something to eat, you can take these boys out back and pick it up in the kitchen. I tell you, man. Come on, Petey, man. I didn't know, man. I told you. What you mean you didn't know? You think I was playing with you? He didn't know, Petey. Look, he don't want to know. When you pull some crap like that, you better be able to back it up. Now let's go, man. Cool out. Cool out. Let's go, Red.
So I'm going to go back through that kind of point by point before and explain all of the points of standpoint theory and where it comes into example here. So we'll watch this first point.
Look here, man. All right, this here Virginia. All right, they got problems with, they don't want us to do. No, man, that's history, bro. It's on me. Come on.
Okay, so from what I've explained of what standpoint theory is, what just happened there?
So the 2 black characters had to be aware of that they weren't allowed there, But the white character was like, no, that's not true. Like he wasn't aware of what it was like to be in their situation, but they were aware of both situations.
Okay, and then we have this next part.
With full tonight, boys. What? There's tables all over the place, man. What are you talking about? Well, this is my establishment. I reserve the right to refuse service to anybody. Yeah, that means you too, hippie boy.
Okay. Austin?
Person in the privileged position just didn't understand the positionality of the other.
And I also like this especially because we just see somebody who just got marginalized. Sunshine, the white guy, he's from California, he's in Virginia, he looks like a hippie, and hippies aren't welcome in Virginia where it's not as progressive. And so he was just marginalized and he just gained a standpoint that if he wants to fit into Virginia, he's gonna have to look like them. Which also brings in that ethnocentric vibe again. Okay.
Now y'all want something to eat, you can take these boys out back to the kitchen. Let's tell you, man. I didn't know, man. I told you. What you mean you didn't know? You think I was playing with you? He didn't know. Look, he don't want to know.
And honestly, that's probably the most important part. Why am I highlighting this part? Did you have something, Joe?
Well, I think that, I mean, we talk about positionality. Like, you can change your position if you really reflect on it, but I think what this shows really well is that sometimes you don't really, even if you reflect on your position, I say it, I do have privilege because I'm a white heterosexual male. I do have privilege. I still, even though I've reflected on it, may still not understand the standpoint or the experience of someone who's less privileged than me. So like, even though he was told specifically, no, this isn't gonna happen, we're not gonna be let in, he didn't really understand what that meant until he had been rejected with them.
Yeah. And I think the most important line that PD says, he says, what do you mean you didn't know? I told you. And then he says, he didn't want to know. Why does he not want to know? Why does the white man not want to know about the discrimination towards black people, potentially?
Doesn't want to feel like he's being given special benefits.
And a big point is that the majority part of the population, or the successful, benefits off of the marginalized. So for there to be people in power, there have to be people who aren't in power. Kind of makes me think of that Incredibles line, if everybody's super, then no one is. Yeah.
Just to point out, like at the beginning too, I lost my point. Oh, just because these are his friends, and I think at the beginning when he's like, no, that's history. Like this isn't something that happens now. I think like that's another reason maybe he didn't want to know about that, because like in his head, like that's history, and he's gone over that, and these are his friends now, and so he's like, oh, you can be with me now because that's history, and so of course he wouldn't want to know if that's still going on.
Yeah. So the two black men in this have this understanding that even though we want to believe it's history, they know it's not, because they have to deal with it every single day. And in Rome of the Titans, there's another very hard scene to watch where Blue is, anyway, he's walking down a street and he sees a police officer and gets very scared. And as white people, as most of us are in this room, we have no idea what that feels like to be just profiled walking down the street in a white neighborhood. Okay. So the last part of my presentation has to do with how history is different when it comes from somebody who isn't in power. I want you guys to think about what it was like when you were in first or second grade or something and you were learning about Christopher Columbus. Don't take your worldviews that you have now about who Christopher Columbus might be as an educated college person, but as like a third grader, who did you think Christopher Columbus was? Can I get some examples?
American hero.
American hero. Discovered America.
Smart.
You thought he was a relatively good person, right? We have a holiday for him, so we thought he was good. It's a little different when you hear it coming from somebody who might have been marginalized by Christopher Columbus. So I have this video here. This isn't it?
Oh.
You want to grab the lights, Austin?
Oh. Evil. Pure evil. Invader. He got lost coming here, and he's the one that named us Indians because he thought he was in India. So he's not a good figure to the Native community.
Confused? I don't think we should have a holiday for it. Pain, cleaning, North America is like land that could be claimed and could be taken. It's the start of a lot of pain. I guess ignorance.
Oh my God, murder, rapist.
Genocide.
The atrocities committed, just grotesque. And the scars are still felt today.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there because they all started saying the F word. So, why is their perspective a little bit different than what ours might have been? Because they had, yeah.
Well, we benefited from Columbus, and they lost because they didn't lose, but like they were killed. They suffered hardship because
They suffered hardship, and they were marginalized. Yeah.
I also think how we're taught it too. It shapes why our views are different. Because even though like we're alive, we still were taught it a specific way. So from a young age we thought this is what he was, and they may have been taught it a different way, so that's what they've always believed he was as well.
Just comment. What I think is so interesting about this is that this isn't just a Christopher Columbus situation. This is every single situation with an individual. It just goes back to framing, like I was talking about earlier. Based on the outcomes of a said event, it can be looked at either a great victory or a loss. Like that's how it is with every sports game. That's how it is with every history, every war. Like it's so easy for us to think, oh, it's all good in this situation. It's like, well, it never is. And I think when it comes to being marginalized, it just sucks because those that are on the less dominant perspective of that frame, they just get shut down like, no, you're just wrong. You just don't understand it, when that's just not the case.
I think my two concepts go so well together, ethnocentrism and the standpoint theory, because we all have positions, and those positions make us have standpoints, and they show us where we fit into culture, and our cultures are all very different. But where it becomes to be dangerous with ethnocentrism is where we start saying that you think you know everything, and you think that you have the best view of what culture looks like. But because of standpoint theory, we actually understand that maybe the marginalized part of the population has a better understanding of what culture looks like. And there really are power disparities in this nation, and they can lead to hatefulness and bigotry. And the only way we can get past something like this is through understanding who we are, where we stand, and critically analyzing where we stand in our culture.